Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Bois, Brule and Flower Beadwork People, the Métis Experience in Canada. My name is Len Rudner, and on behalf of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, I'm delighted to have you join us today. Today's webinar is presented as part of the CRRF's celebration of National Aboriginal History Month and, on Friday, National Indigenous Peoples Day. Before we begin, a few administrative details. We will follow our usual format for webinars. We will begin with the presentation of our guest, Roy Pogorzelski. At the end of the presentation, I will return to assist with the Q&A section of the program. You may take your questions at any time during the presentation. My colleague, Pan Mazir, and I will group or combine similar questions together in order to make the best use of everyone's time. Thank you. And now let's begin. When we think of the Aboriginal people of Canada, we may not immediately think of the Métis, but the history of this community is intertwined with the story, indeed, the creation of Canada as it exists today. Sharing many of the experiences of other Aboriginal people, the Métis also bore the unfair stigma of being seen as rebels for their support of Louis Riel. We are grateful for this opportunity to learn more about Métis history, culture, and the opportunities that reconciliation offers for a shared future. Roy, it's a great pleasure to have you join us. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Len. I really appreciate the intro, and I just want to say it's quite an honor and a privilege to be able to present on this Race Relations Foundation webinar. And as you stated, I'm going to discuss today the Métis experience in Canada. And part of that comes with some of the experience I've had working on reconciliation. As the TRC calls to action were released in 2015, it put a larger emphasis on being actionable in how we're going to actually reconcile from some of the government policy and assimilation policies in our country that have created very challenging situations in Aboriginal communities. For this presentation today, I'm going to talk a bit about my family, talk about Métis history. But first, I wanted to start off by saying, you know, reconciliation is not a new concept in our country. You know, in 1919, when Frederick Loft returned from World War I, you know, he went around garnering support and activism among the different Aboriginal nations in Canada, and he had to do so kind of on his own dime, under the radar, because under the Indian Act, it was illegal for First Nations people to gather at that time politically. So he went around and garnered support and created the League of Indians of Canada. And in that was this notion of repairing, reconciling relationships, ending the oppressive policies, and working on Aboriginal rights in the country. And that eventually would turn into the Assembly of First Nations as we know it today. You know, in the 60s, during the time of civil rights movements, and for Métis people, we have Howard Adams, who was quite involved in Métis civil rights at that time. There was a Hawthorne report released that talked about the social and economic situation of Aboriginal groups across the country. And it talked about recommendations at that time to start repairing relationships again, and to start, it launched statistics of educational attainment of Aboriginal people, and it really looked at some of those social conditions and called on the government to repair those relationships. You know, as we move towards constitutionalism in our country and the repatriation of the Constitution under Section 35, you know, Aboriginal people weren't considered in part of this early process of repatriating our country. It was bringing in different provinces, and leaders, both First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, had to kind of descend on Ottawa to fight to have Aboriginal rights treaty and Aboriginal rights respected in the Constitution, as well as listing out who the Aboriginal groups were. For the Métis, that was an extremely important moment because, oh, maybe I'll put my video on here if that will help. Sorry about that. So that was a very important moment because for the Métis people to be entrenched in the Constitution and have our rights respected by the government was vastly important. In 1885, when Louis Riel was executed, one of his final sayings was that in 100 years, the Métis will come back and it'll be the artists that bring them back. And in 1982, that was a really important moment for Métis people. So I'll talk about that as well. But constitutionalism created an opportunity to not only address Aboriginal rights, but look into repairing those relationships. Then we had the Penner report just following that came out, and it talked about self-determination, it talked about self-government, it talked about moving away from the Indian Act for First Nations people. And it talked about building that capacity to be self-determining. And again, with a change of government, that report was essentially tabled. Then we come to 1996, and we had our Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report, which was an extremely comprehensive study on the state of Indigenous people across the country. It went around and listened to the stories of Aboriginal groups, Indigenous groups across the country, coast to coast. It looked at the treatment of Aboriginal people and focused on a repairing of relationships, even talking about the need for healing in Aboriginal communities. And it came out with a number of recommendations that looked at repairing this new relationship and building a new relationship between the federal government and Aboriginal people in our country and between Canadians in general. And those recommendations were never acted upon, even though in 1998, there was this statement of reconciliation that came out from the federal government at that time. So here we are, 20 years later from that report, and we have the launch of the TRC calls to action, which are very important for a number of different entities, for justice, for health, for faith-based institutions, educational institutions, municipalities, provincial and federal governments, to look at how to repair this relationship and educate and provide awareness about the history of Aboriginal people. And oftentimes the Métis story in Canada was often told by outsiders to the culture. It was often told about us, until quite recently when Métis authors started publishing their own stories and telling their own stories. So there's been a lot of misconceptions about who the Métis people are in Canada, and there's a lot of education and awareness to do on that front as well. So one of the biggest things we talk about when we're talking about reconciliation, and I'll dive into this personally, I'm in Blackfoot territory here. I've had the pleasure of working closely with Blackfoot community, Métis community here, and also the municipal government to look at reconciliation. And one of the biggest challenges is that if we talk about decolonization in today's context, we're talking about changing systems that were put in place that have become quite oppressive towards Aboriginal people and eliminating institutional and systemic racism. So that's one of the biggest parts about, if you look at the 94 calls to action, that you'll see in there is that there's a lot of discussion around the law. There's a lot of discussion around healthcare practices. There's a lot of discussion around educational institutions and indigenization. So in reconciliation, one of the biggest things, and especially from a Métis experience, is every individual's personal story is vastly different. We can't homogenize the notion of reconciliation, and we have to really understand and respect the intersectionality of identity in the Aboriginal population is vastly diverse. Even me speaking on it today, I'll speak from a personal context, but knowing that even within our own Métis nation across the homeland, there's quite a large diversity and intersectionality of identity. And I think that uniqueness makes it really great to kind of correspond with other Métis people across the homeland. Urban cities have more Métis, Inuit, First Nations living, working, and being a part of urban centers. And so that's very important. And I think today in our world, when it comes to Métis identity politics, a lot of Métis people are in the process of reclaiming identity because of a history that's been very highly oppressive towards Métis people, and I'll talk about that in a moment here as well. And I think as well, just identity politics, there's been a lot of challenges with the government determining who is and who isn't Aboriginal, with some of the gender discriminatory policies in the Indian Act. There's been a lot of challenges around this notion of identity, and we're going to have a lot more discussions on who is, who isn't Aboriginal in this country in the future because of the complexity of identity as well. Both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people's ancestors had a role in shaping Canada, and the Métis people in Canada had large contributions to the development of this country that have been often either ignored or just not discussed in our educational curriculum in the past. And so I think that's important in reconciliation, is understanding how both sides worked to shape this and speaking at it from the truth. Aboriginal narratives have been ignored, and stories have often been told by descendants of settler society. And you'll see that too. If you look at Métis, there's a lot of publications on the Métis people. If you look at the way the media has construed Métis identity, if you look back at old newspaper articles, oftentimes misconceptions have been relayed, stories that aren't factual have been put out there, and it's been very damaging for the understanding of who is and who isn't Métis. Intergenerational effects play a large role in how things have played out. I mean, my mom and grandma, and I'll talk a bit about both of them, went to the schools up in northern Saskatchewan, and both of them have terrible experiences from those schools that they've shared with me. And again, you see those intergenerational effects being passed down through family members, and it's very challenging to break that cycle. And so there's a lot more emphasis on how can we bring the culture back to people, how can we heal people, and how can we make early years children from birth to age proud of being Métis in our country. Aboriginal people in Canada have had their cultures attacked and really been removed from it. And even in our context in Canada, when we started to move away from the church-run residential schools into more, when the government started taking over them, we turned into child welfare as kind of the carry-on towards that assimilation policy by taking Aboriginal people out. A lot of Métis road allowance people, which again I'll talk about in a moment, their children were scooped up and put into child welfare. And so we have a lot of people coming back to the culture who've had their identity taken away from the 60s scoop or from residential schools and being adopted into foster care, and it's been very, very challenging. So reclaiming identity is quite large. As well as understanding trauma and this understanding of how systemic racism really affects Aboriginal people in our country is very important to reconciliation. And reconciliation, this is just some personal stuff from a lot of the work that I've been doing in the community, is that oftentimes whether we get stuck on the term, what is reconciliation? And we have a very challenging time of trying to even wrap our heads around how to move forward and advance these relationships. And if you look at the TRC and you read that report, a lot of it is on building meaningful and intentional relationships that are based on mutual respect, so we can start to advance the work from a truthful perspective. And I think that's the most important thing, is having passionate people that want to do it in a meaningful way. The concept of reconciliation means something different to everyone. And so when you're in a group, everyone's got a different experience and a different kind of notion of what it is that they bring to the table. And so I think that's extremely important when we're addressing concepts of reconciliation. Everyone's journey towards awareness is quite different. And even in our Aboriginal communities today, a lot of our families are learning about their culture, learning about their history in a moment where I would say it's more safe to be Aboriginal in this moment, even though there's still a lot of discrimination. You see a lot of people trying to return, wanting to return to their identity and their cultural identity for healing purposes and just to come back to the culture because of a lot of the high oppression made a lot of families turn away from the culture at that time. Lived experience plays a large factor in how we reconcile as well. And that's why today I thought I would share my family story with you in this context, because it's that lived experience from survivors, from elders, from knowledge keepers, from our community members that really allows us to keep our culture alive, keep our stories alive, and keep our traditional knowledge-based practices alive as Métis people. Reconciliation is a very abstract concept, and if we're not careful, with how we advance this work, it could become another buzzword that's just meaningless symbolism on how we do this work. So that's why it really has to be done with meaning and with intent. And I think that that's very important in any type of work we do in communities with reconciliation. If we're effective in this and we can start to decolonize some of the systems that are really perpetuating oppression towards Aboriginal people, whether that be in business or, like I said, health or justice, we will improve relations and eliminate systemic racism and remove barriers of access to society. But if we don't take meaning to this and we don't understand the history or learn or gain awareness about it, we run the risk of it being ineffective, divisive, symbolic, and really, really empty. So that's very important. So, in our history of acting towards, positive race relations between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in Canada, we started at the notion of we were reporting on it, learning about it. We went to recommendations. We've now come to calls to action. And just recently, we've named it Calls to Justice in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry. And so you see the language really calling on Canadians to act on these very important issues in our country. So to get more into some of the Métis history as it applies into reconciliation and the notion of educating today, I put up a timeline here that's quite well known. There's often a joke that few colleagues and elders would tell me is when was the first Métis person born? And they say 9 months after the first European, because it's really hard to trace down when exactly the start of this miscegenation was in Canada. But it originated in Eastern Canada, in Central and Atlantic Canada. And that's why today we see the complexity behind the identity discussion, where it talks about the Eastern Métis and the Western Métis from the historic homeland. And those are some of the differentiations that come from that. Is the historic homeland was where the Métis nationalism really grew, and then you've got Eastern Métis. So you'll see a lot of discussion around who is and who isn't Métis at a political level. And I won't go too much into the politics of it, but what I will say is we have a lot of Eastern origins of Métis people in Canada. From 1750 to 1800 was really time for a lot of migration west into the Red River area, and Métis people were very migratory as they were traders, trappers, voyagers, guides, scouts, interpreters, and they really followed the fur trade industry as well. And when the Northwest Company came up in 1779, it offered a unique opportunity in kind of that corporate competition between the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company. And naturally, many Métis worked in and around the fur trade in these companies. Coming over to Western Canada, the Red River area offered a locality, a space for Métis nationalism to grow. And I'm not going to say the birth of the Métis Nation, because the Métis people were already around. This was the birth of Métis nationalism. In an 1870 census, there was 10,000 Métis documented in that area out of potential 12,000 people on the census. So it was quite a large group that we're talking about in the Red River area. And that allowed for a lot of the culture to go around language, around dance and arts, around beadwork, and just even around laws and politics of our communities. The true birth of Métis nationalism came in around 1812, 1812-ish area, around the Battle of Seven Oaks and the Battle of Frog Plain. And that was a very important battle for the Métis in the Red River area. We were led by our first leader, Cuthbert Grant, and I just saw a post today that he's got a nice plaque and space of recognition in Winnipeg. And he led the Métis against Robert Semple and the Hudson Bay Company post there, and we were victorious. And in that, we gave ourselves our first national anthem, La Chanson de Grenier, which was written by Pierre Felson, and brought a lot of unity, nationalism, as well as being presented with our Métis flag, which was very important in around that time. From 1821 to 1870, is the golden years for Métis, as they call them. These were years where we were quite involved in free trade. In 1821, the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company merged to form the Hudson Bay Company as one monopoly over trade in Canada. And a lot of Métis at this time were free traders on the prairies. They traded across the 49th parallel, the Medicine Line. They traded anywhere that they would trade to different posts, and often free trade down into the United States. And what ended up happening was there was a trial even back in the day called the Sayre trial in 1849, where the Hudson Bay Company tried to exact their authority, and the Métis surrounded the courthouse, and eventually the judge had to let them go because they just didn't have the legal authority to prosecute the free traders. So that was really a time of prosperous free trade for Métis people. And then we go up to resistance and dispersal. This is the period of time where most Canadians are somewhat familiar with Métis history in Canada. You know, when I go around and speak, a lot of people know of the name Louis Riel, and that'll be one of the first things that they know about. But like, again, we've said, there's been a lot of discussion and debate, and to the Métis people, Louis Riel is a hero of our people. And a lot of Canadians have this misconception of who Louis Riel might be. I think today we're getting better understanding of who he is as more Métis authors start writing about Louis Riel, exploring his journals and his diaries, and really talking about his character as a leader and his real role in building democracy. But this resistance and dispersal, a lot of my family members were in the Red River, participating at the time of the Red River resistance. And at that time, a lot of the river lots, surveyors were coming in to survey them up for settlement. And so naturally the Métis resisted and wanted their culture, language, or land rights protected in Manitoba joining into Confederation. And so Section 31 of the Manitoba Act really speaks to that. And today the Manitoba Métis Federation won that court case that delivered back the 1.4 million hectares of land back to the Métis Nation that were essentially stolen through unscrupulous methods, but also through scrip applications and so forth. And so post-1870, what changed in Canada at that time was the Northwest Mounted Police was established in 1873. One of their main objectives was to go and really contain Aboriginal groups across the prairies. They were a paramilitary force that was set up based on the Irish Constabulary in Ireland that John A. Macdonald kind of looked at as an example. And the Wolseley expedition came through the Red River area, and really the goal of that was to remove the Métis from that area, as there was a lot of not only French and Catholic hatred at that time, but there was also a lot of hatred towards the Métis. And so a lot of our families had to migrate further west, and a lot of my family would end up moving to northern Saskatchewan. We go into a period of the forgotten years for Métis people, and that can really kind of drag on, where Métis culture and identity was just not something that was really talked about. It was not something that was produced, and I'll go into some of the reasons why we have this kind of scattered of identity among our nation in a moment. We also have the road allowance people, and you see more articles coming out about the road allowance people. And they were folks that lived in little log cabins, whether it was on the fringe of white communities, or it was in ditches or along roads. And they lived a very impoverished life in Canada with really no rights or access to healthcare, education. And again, in the child welfare system, children would be scooped up and put into foster care. So there was a large diaspora of kind of the Métis Nation across the homeland. So when you go across the homeland today, you will see reclaiming in British Columbia, you'll see it in Alberta, you'll see it in Manitoba, you'll see it in Saskatchewan, and there's a lot of education coming out. You'll see it in the Northwest Territories, and you'll see it in Ontario, and again, some of the discussions around the Maritimes and of course, Quebec. And then in 1930s to 1960s, the struggle and rebirth of the Métis. You know, we all had relatives, and I had relatives in Saskatchewan that were fighting for Métis rights in the 30s. And it wasn't until the 60s that, Howard Adams starts this large push of Métis activism. And, we have the book of Maria Campbell, Half-Breed, that came out in the early 70s, which really shone a light on child welfare, road allowance, and her experience. And we also had the Richard Cardinal case in the late 80s, which really shone a light on child welfare and foster care. And that happened here up in northern Alberta, where Richard Cardinal committed suicide as a young man who went through about 28 foster homes and was treated very poorly in the child welfare system. We start to see a lot of that coming out, which is bringing a lot of emphasis on Métis identity and culture. And of course, emergence of new political and educational organizations for the Métis people from 1965 to the 1980s was very important as we brought back political societies, as we started to lobby at the federal level and at provincial levels for Métis rights and knowledge of our culture, and bring back people to that level of activism and sense of pride. 1980 to present was the search for self-determination and self-government, and that's where we're currently sitting today, is determining our own membership criteria, looking around. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at the chat here. Yeah, I'll provide a list of books, absolutely, you betcha. So the search for self-determination and self-government is highly important today because it's about determining our own educational systems for our youth. It's about taking control of early years development for our children. And there's projects all across the homeland now where we're looking at the years birth to 8 and educating those young children about the culture so that they could be proud when they go into school. One of the biggest challenges today is with the term Aboriginal. It's a very homogenous term, which encompasses a large diversity, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And oftentimes in programming, the Métis get kind of just shuffled into kind of mainstream programming, and there's not a real focus or emphasis on Métis culture and identity. And I think that's really important in early years development for young youth to gain that passion and pride. So the big question today is, who are the Métis and what do you know about them? And oftentimes when we talk about the Métis experience in Canada, we're talking about Métis identity and what that means to a Métis person. And I'll run through my own here in a moment. I was very fortunate, though. I was raised up in a very traditional family, and when I was growing up, I didn't really understand or know what this was all about. I was just a young kid around the language, around the food, around the culture, around the dancing. And even today, I've Red River jigged across the country and internationally. But as I get older, it's tougher to perform. But, you never knew that this stuff was special. It was just culture. And then as you came out into high school and you started to realize what little people knew about the Métis, or you talked to some of your family members who said maybe you shouldn't talk about what happened in northern Saskatchewan, you started to realize just how complex Métis identity could be. But even from that standpoint, today there's a lot of people coming back to the culture, people that are learning that they're Métis, and as a nation, we are really embracing having people come back to our culture and to our nation. Now, just to talk a bit about my family, and where they come from. My great-great-great-grandfather, Donald Ross, married Catherine Delorme in St. Francois Xavier in the Red River area. And he was instrumental in the Red River area, working with Louis Riel and getting that Manitoba Act passed. When he migrated up to northern Saskatchewan, he joined Louis Riel's provisional government. Again, migrating up to northern Saskatchewan was because land was taken away in Manitoba. And as he was up there and he joined Louis Riel's provisional government, he went to defend Métis land and cultural rights at the Battle of Batoche. And he was in there with a number of other elders that even stayed behind to allow a lot of the young families to flee the area. And he was actually the last one to die at Batoche at the age of 63. One of our uncles as well was Joseph Ouellette. He was 93 years old, and he died at the Battle of Batoche. So it's interesting as I go across the homeland and talk with Métis people, and a lot of us have connections to relatives from northern Saskatchewan. My great-great-great-grandfather, Joseph Flammand, fought in the Battle of Batoche as well, and he married Theresa Houle Flammand, Theresa Houle. And after post-Batoche, he actually migrated down into Montana through the Milk River and settled near Blackfeet territory, and would stay there for a while as kind of what you would know today as like a political refugee. And as he came back into Alberta, he went up and settled in Pincher Creek, and that's kind of where that family stayed. So you see a lot of these migration patterns. In fact, my great-grandmother, Mary Adele Fiddler, was born in Pincher Creek. My great-great-great-grandfather, Laurent Garneau, is very interesting. It's interesting to hear about his history because he actually was a trader, a fur trader, and a cattle rancher. And he got kind of locked in at the Red River area, and he ended up fighting alongside Louis Riel in the Red River Resistance. And he was actually charged by the Hudson Bay Company for his role in that resistance. And it was Father Lacombe who kind of went to bat for him to get the government to release the charges. And he moved up to northern Alberta and helped found St. Paul de Métis up there in northern Alberta. And he became quite a wealthy businessman up in that area, and he worked really hard. But again, he even lost land around the U of A. So they give him a plaque in Edmonton to kind of pay respects to who he was as a business person and how he helped the Métis Nation and settled in that area. And there's a picture of him and Eleanor as well, his wife. My great-great-grandfather, Jean-Baptiste Fiddler, actually married Veronique Gervais in the Church of Batoche in 1884, and they had a one-year-old kid. He was 23 years old at the time that the Battle of Batoche took place, and he fought alongside Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont in the Métis at Batoche there. Following that, like our other family, he went down into Montana and back up through Pincher Creek. He would eventually return to Meadow Lake, and he led a 5-person crew to construct the highway from Meadow Lake to North Battleford in northern Saskatchewan. So that was really, important history for our family to know. My great-grandmother, he's actually, Jean-Baptiste Fiddler's a relation of Peter Fiddler, the cartographer, down that line. My great-great-great-grandfather, Cyprien Morin, actually was one of the founders of the communities of Meadow Lake, and here he is with his wife, Mary Cook. And they settled up in that area where my mom was actually essentially born in Meadow Lake, and my grandma was born in Green Lake. And they were up in that area settling during that time. And post-1885 went through a lot of oppression in northern Saskatchewan. And even to this day, when you look at what happened in and around northern Saskatchewan with the Colton Boushie case and some of the comments that you saw on Facebook, some of the things that you've heard about, that was northern Saskatchewan. There's a lot of racism up in that area, and for Métis people, a lot of it centers around this type of history. My uncles Norbert, Ralph, Peter, Paul, and Gerard Baptiste, they enlisted in World War I to go fight overseas for Canada, and when they actually came back from their time overseas, there was a lot of discrimination towards them. They weren't given any military rights or benefits, and they were simply just treated as half-breeds, as it stated on their application when they applied. And so there wasn't a lot of rights. And then Norbert would go on to have 53 grandchildren in northern Saskatchewan. But again, you see this notion of reconciliation. And when I look at my family history, I see my family post-1885 really participating, not only participating in Canada, but really trying to build relationships in Canada. One of my uncles, Alex Bishop, was very important in starting kind of the Métis Society of Saskatchewan. And he was actually offered a Justice of the Peace by Tommy Douglas and turned it down because he felt that it would water down his fight for Métis rights in the 30s. And so a very important figure there. And his son in the 70s would actually run for the federal government. And under the Indian Act, First Nations people couldn't vote in federal elections until the 60s. So there wasn't participation in our politics here in the country. So Rod Bishop, when he ran as an independent in northern Saskatchewan, and you can see the Cree syllabics on his post there. He didn't end up winning, but it was really inspiring to see him in the 70s take on that role as an independent and fight for Native voice up in northern Saskatchewan. My great-grandmother, Mary Adele Fiddler and Emile Morin, were very important in our world because they kept our culture intact. And there's Veronique Gervais in that picture as well. But they kept our culture intact, and they really stayed up in northern Saskatchewan during times where it was really not popular to be Métis in Saskatchewan post-1885. There was a lot of oppression. There was a lot of discrimination, and they stayed up there and fought for our culture and passed it down. My great-grandmother, Helen Garneau and Albert Aubichon, and I actually had the pleasure of meeting Helen when I was young. I'd sit down and listen to her stories during her later days when she was in a wheelchair, and she'd share a lot of stories with me. And being a young kid hearing these stories, they were always really important stories, but you were just so young. It was just amazing to be raised up to hear some of those stories, and I didn't know what kind of impact that would have on me throughout my life. My grandpa Fred Morin, he enlisted again in the Canadian military and spent some time overseas. And again, when he came back, to this day, my grandma still doesn't have his military pension. He passed away from cancer when I was 11. And Grandpa Fred, he could play the fiddle, he could jig, he was very passionate about Métis rights. And I remember being young, just being around the dinner table, and he'd always sit at the head of the table, and he'd always talk about Métis politics, and he'd talk about Métis rights and what happened up in northern Saskatchewan. And as a young kid, I'd hear those stories, and it was just always kind of amazing to sit around those stories. He'd sit down and watch horse racing with me. I'll be honest with you, I was quite bored of it, but it was spending time with my grandpa, and he was always a fun guy. He would take me to my soccer games, and my dad would give me $1 for a goal. And so Grandpa Freddie would just sleep in the car. And when I got back, I'd tell him, "Hey, I scored 4 goals. Tell my dad that." And he'd go and tell my dad that I got 4 goals. So I got a little bit of money for that. But my dad found out years later and says, "Well, what's the interest on $4?" So, so good memories of my Grandpa Freddie. But I'm sad that he's gone because a lot of the knowledge that he had of our culture went with him at a pivotal age for me when I was 11. My grandma Dora Morin, or Dora Aubichon, is just one of the strongest figures in my life. I spend a lot of time with my grandma. We spend a lot of time making, food, Métis food, and we spend a lot of time. She'll speak some of the language to me. She speaks Michif, she speaks Cree, but she doesn't write. So I really have to listen to what she's saying when she speaks to me, whether it be in Michif and Cree. And it's very challenging for me at this time to learn the language other than a few words here and there because of how busy life is and the fact that it's all oral based. So that goes to show just how challenging it is. But she'll sit down and cook with me. She's told me many stories. And she's told me stories of her time in the schools up in northern Saskatchewan, told me about her interactions with the nuns. And it's had a really profound effect on me because I just can't believe that this could happen to my grandmother, who's one of the loveliest women in the world and one of, really, really one of the funniest people that I know, and she always tells me a story that I'll share with you. And I've been very fortunate because my grandma and my aunties have shared quite a few stories with me that I really listen to and take in about the old days. But she would always tell me in Meadow Lake and Green Lake area, she was the best rabbit catcher up in northern Saskatchewan. She could catch all the rabbits. And so her mom, Helen Garneau, told her that her cousins were delivered by rabbits because Helen was a midwife, so she'd deliver a lot of the cousins. And she told my grandma that it was rabbits that delivered the babies. So one day when one of her cousins was being delivered, my grandma saw a rabbit and thought that was the rabbit that was going to deliver her cousin. So my grandma wanted to catch it. So she chased down the rabbit and couldn't catch the rabbit. And then she always ends up and stops the story and goes, Roy, she goes, gee, I was dumb, because she was 16 years old at the time and lived in the bush. And she goes, I thought at 16 that rabbits delivered babies. And she always laughs. She tells me that story every time I go and sit down with her. So that storytelling is just so valuable and vital to a lot of the things I know and keep with me. And she's also taught me a lot about resilience and perseverance because she's really the glue to our family. And my mom, Audrey Morin, my mom is one of the most important people in my life. She went through the school, a lot of discrimination my mom's went through, and a lot of abuse. And growing up, I didn't understand what that meant. I didn't understand when she had anxiety or panic attacks. I really didn't understand about her upbringing. So it was hard for me as a kid, you know, especially I got my dad's last name. He's a Pogrzewski, and I came out light skinned. You know, I didn't understand this history growing up. And when I was 18, one of her psychologists told her that maybe she should let me read her journal about what had happened to her in her past. And so I read through some of the journal, and it was a very challenging time for me, especially going into university. I went in a very, well, let's just say a very angry young man of reading about the history of what happened to my mom. I couldn't understand how something like this could happen. And my mom always worked hard to provide me with love and to kind of shelter me from the discrimination that was out there. You know, we always lived in low income housing, but she really worked hard to ensure that me and my brother had opportunities. So she's really taught me so much about resilience. You know, she spoke Cree up until she was 8, and then she lost the language. And now, you know, she doesn't speak Cree with me, but she shares a lot of stories from the past with me, and she's really been a source of my resiliency and my perseverance as a young Métis person. And even as I tried to understand my identity growing up as a Métis person and what it meant, because my mom's got very dark skin, so she's faced a lot of different discrimination than I have. She faces a lot of the overt discrimination, whereas I hear a lot of the real comments of people about what they think about Indigenous people because of my objective appearance. And so growing up with that was always challenging for me. And then there's me. I'm really appreciative that I was passed down my culture and the ability to really teach my culture. And I teach a lot of it through dance. I've been jigging for a very long time. I'm getting older and slower, but I still enjoy performing. In fact, I've got a number of performances through Southern Alberta coming up in the next few days. But dancing has really been an expression of keeping my culture alive and educating people about who I am as a Métis person in Canada. And growing up, I was born in 1982. I was born during the time of constitutional change in our country, where Métis people were added to the Constitution. And still in this time, I've seen a lot of challenges. And as more education comes out about the Métis experience in Canada, you'll see more discussions on identity politics. You will see other political entities rise up. You'll see a lot of changes happening in our country, and I think that it's important that we maintain strong to our culture and have pride in who we are as Métis people. And that bodes well for telling our stories. You know, one of the biggest things is my grandma and my mom both have said, you know, Roy, we're okay with you sharing our stories because it's so important that it gets out. Because even when the TRC did their hearings across the country, the Métis experience was quite ignored in many cases. And so now it's just recent that the Métis experience is becoming more known. So when we talk about identity politics for Métis today, there's a few things that we have to consider. You know, post 1885, when we talked about those forgotten years, those road allowance years, the diaspora that happened with the Métis Nation, due to federal government really not wanting to work with our nation. And if you even look back at old John A. Macdonald quotes, he really considered the Métis a third race, a third unwanted race in our country, and he's on record as quoting those things. So you look today, for the longest time, the federal government has not known how to deal with us. So when you look at the Daniels case today that came out, and the headline came out that Métis are now Indians, and then I got a ton of phone calls from folks, but that meant under the British North American Act, Section 94, Section 94, I believe, under the British North American Act, talks about the government of Canada having control over Indians and lands reserved for Indians. And so the Inuit in 1939 had to prove that they were in there with their case, the Crown versus Eskimo, and the Métis through the Daniels case proved that they were Indians for the purpose of that fiduciary responsibility by the federal government and that relationship with the federal government to negotiate as a nation-to-nation basis. So that was a very important decision for the Métis because it really has changed the scope in which we negotiate and deal with the federal government. So that's extremely important. But post-1885, the Métis were really divided up into four categories. There was the one category where Métis families could integrate or assimilate into Canadian society. These were families that were proud of past accomplishments, but had European last names, had light skin, and could essentially assimilate to be Canadian. And with that came a number of benefits that were for Canadian citizens at that time. There was the road allowance people, and again, like I mentioned, these were Métis that lived in little log houses on the fringe of white communities or on the fringe of roadways, or in certain ditch areas or wherever they could find a space. And there was not a lot of rights for road allowance people in our country at that time. So they faced a lot of discrimination, they faced a lot of racism, and they even faced at times forced removal from areas by the government. There was those that lived on the fringe of reserves who could go into their relatives' community and take treaty. If you were dark enough and you had a First Nations last name, you could go on to a First Nations community and take treaty, and then you would have treaty rights with that group. And we know the history of treaty rights being broken promises and not being respected, but still those treaty rights were certain rights that were there for the benefit of families. And then you had families like a lot of my family members were in isolated communities where they practiced Métis culture and faced a lot of discrimination from the government. And so with that, they were able to really keep a lot of the culture intact and bring it back to in the 1960s through to the 1980s. So that was really important. So today, when we talk about Métis rights, it's very complicated because the government has turned to the legal system to define what Aboriginal rights are in our country, rather than politicians trying to understand the rights. They've really turned to the courts. And if you look at our Supreme Court system in Canada and our legal system, prior to the 1940s, we had to go to the Privy Council in England to make final decisions on anything related in Canada. Aboriginal groups couldn't pool money together to have lawyers under the Indian Act, so we couldn't fight. There couldn't be fights for Aboriginal title or any of that nature. And in Section 35, when the rights were put in there, they were recognized and affirmed, but the government often argued they were never defined. So there's often a discussion: was Section 35 or the constitutional box a box of treasures full of Aboriginal rights, or was it an empty box of promises full of very little? So the Métis identity question becomes very important in this case because there was access to harvesting rights and harvesting practices for Métis harvesters, as well as in that Section 35 box, what are the rights to self-government? What are the rights to self-determination? And a number of those questions that have not been answered yet that may be answered in the future. But with this box, when you look at the TRC calls to action, and this is where it becomes very complicated, in our legal system, we've played off the notion of doctrine of discovery with a concept of terra nullius, which meant that a land could be discovered if it was considered void of civilized people, as a justification from European nations for taking land and gaining international legal ownership over it. And in our TRC calls to action, they call for that to be acknowledged and removed from further and future court cases. And so when you looked at defining Aboriginal rights, a lot of it stemmed from those early colonial entities in law that stayed in our Commonwealth system and still play a role in defining Aboriginal rights today and narrowing that scope of Aboriginal rights. So when we started this journey of looking at what are Aboriginal rights under the constitutional box, there was cases that came out, the Sparrow case, the Vanderpeet case, and these cases really took a look at defining Aboriginal rights by using tests. One test would be proof of Aboriginal title test. Another one would be the proof of distinctive culture test. And for the Métis, it was always very challenging because the Métis the Métis came about because of contact, and so we couldn't put Aboriginal rights or Aboriginal title into a pre-contact time frame. So in 2003, Métis rights were finally tested at the Supreme Court under the constitutional box in the Powley Test in 2003, and it merged the Sparrow and the Vanderpeet test into a longer Powley Test, which also looks at identifying Métis communities, identifying Métis identity, and who can have access to Aboriginal rights in this constitutional box. And I remember being in a human justice class in 2003, and it was the teacher comes in, and on the front page of the paper it says Métis people have rights. And she came to me and said, "Roy, congratulations, you have rights." And I said, "Well, I've always had rights, but thank you." And she goes, "Can you explain this to me?" And at that time it was so fresh that I could not, but it spurred me to want to study it more, especially from a harvesting context. And so I put up the test here, and it really is just about how you go about proving a Métis right to harvest or hunt and fish. But one of the things in this, it gave out ideas of what Métis identity could be, but it never gave a comprehensive understanding of who the Métis people are for the case of accessing rights in Section 35. Of course, membership is up to our Métis nations across the homeland in determining their members. And again, that has created some challenges as well, fitting under our Métis National Council scope. The proof to our government, Métis people, First Nations people, we all, whether we're collective or whether we're individual, we've always had to prove to the government that we're Aboriginal. You can even still see that today on applications, and of course there could be the other side of the argument that, well, if you didn't need to prove it, then everybody could make some kind of claim. But really that argument negates the culture and the kinship and the genealogical connection to not only the Métis communities or where we're from, that historic Métis community or accepted Métis communities, but it really just negates that cultural piece that is so important to Aboriginal people across the country. So even in Aboriginal rights cases today, it's always on the Aboriginal people to prove that they have a right to a certain entity or that they have title to something, rather than the government having to prove that they have a right to something. So Métis citizenship today follows a criteria. When you're applying for citizenship into a Métis nation, whether it be Métis Nation Alberta, Métis Nation BC, you have to prove your extensive genealogy. And that's the genealogy I kind of just ran through today, going back to usually the 1850s, looking at who your ancestors were, that kinship and cultural connection. Self-identification is part of it. You have to self-identify as a Métis person. And that doesn't mean just saying, hey, I'm Métis. That means self-identifying with a unique culture of being Métis, whether that be the clothing, whether that be the language, the arts, the political and legal entities of being Métis, but just self-identifying with that. There's an ancestral connection to the historic Métis community, whether that be in Red River area or that be in a historic community in northern Saskatchewan. A lot of people like to say that that goes back to the Red River, and a lot of Métis from that historic nation, or that when that nationalism grew, can trace their roots back to the Red River. But even at the Red River genealogy, most of us can trace an ancestor further east, whether it be from Quebec or another area. Métis community acceptance, the community has to accept you into being Métis, and that's very important. And a lot of that comes from discussions on genealogy, discussions on culture, and your contributions to certain communities as a Métis person. So recently, and I'll just kind of wind up here, I see that time's kind of coming to an end, but recently we had the historic Métis homeland released, and it was a more narrower version of what the homeland used to be. And this spurred a lot of discussion and a lot of controversy. I think one of the reasons for that is social media. Even in our TRC call to action, social media, that different form of media, does a good job at spreading information very quickly. Whereas when the Powley case came out in 2003, there wasn't Facebook yet. There wasn't a way to spread it so quickly. And same with when the RCAP report came out in 1994. This homeland was very interesting because it got a lot of people thinking that the Métis were saying this is our land per se from an ownership perspective, and that's really not what was coming out there. What was coming out was putting out a homeland map to identify membership across the homeland, especially as you've heard the history of migration for Métis people, and identifying, having self-determination over our membership criteria, as well as setting the boundaries and from a political entity to prevent cultural misappropriation when it comes to Métis identity. Now, again, that's another largely contested issue, as today you're going to hear a lot of debates and discussion around the Eastern Métis identity politics and this notion of current nationalism. And again, I won't get too into the politics behind it, but those are some of the debates and discussions we see happening throughout our country currently. So finally, just to end off, reconciliation to me, I mean, with my family personally, my family were considered rebels and traitors to Canada. And I remember being a young kid in social studies class and being told that Louis Riel was a rebel. And a lot of my friends knew that I was Métis and from that area. And they would ask me, so is your family the rebels? Are they the ones that fought Canada? And it was always awkward being a high school student to have to try to talk about a history that I really did not know a lot about at that time, but almost being on the defense of it. Métis stories have been ignored, and we've had to fight in colonial courts to not only acquire our Aboriginal rights, but really we've had to turn to the courts to weigh in on who is and who isn't Métis for the purpose of accessing our rights in this country. And these are very imperial courts that still run on that same old common law. So it becomes very challenging when we go to the courts to determine who is and who isn't Métis for the purpose of accessing certain harvesting rights and having those decisions made for us. My relatives were placed in residential and church schools, and there was even a fire where some of our young relatives perished during this time. And again, hearing about that part of history, it's just so recent. It's as recent as I can talk to my mom about it and talk to my grandma about it. So for us to act like this is outdated history is just it's just ignorant, because it's history that's currently affecting not only Métis people today, but First Nations and Inuit people as well. In order to improve race relations in our country, reconciliation is really the foundation for that. But in reconciliation, we have to identify what the truth is, and we have to learn about that. We have to start building meaningful relationships with each other that's forward thinking and that's looking into the future so that our future generations can benefit from our knowledge of what happened and how we worked about repairing those relationships. Generational healing is extremely important in our country's context, and for Métis people, a lot of that is having access to the culture. I was fortunate enough to be in Kelowna with the Métis Nation of BC last month at a Métis cultural camp, where we brought Métis families together to partake in language, partake in Red River cart races, partake in just gathering together, the food, the camaraderie, the dancing. And it was absolutely amazing to see the young kids really engaging and embracing the culture in ways that I never had access to publicly or communally. I had access to in my immediate family. And cultural safety, of course, is very important. And really in our systems, we just have to continue to work to eliminate racism, discrimination, xenophobia, hate, misconceptions, prejudices, and all those things. And we need these systems to change in order to allow for, even from an employment and business perspective, just allow for more opportunities for Aboriginal people to participate and be part of our city centers. On that note, that's my final slide. So I just want to say that I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of my experiences. And I'm hoping that, I'm hoping that there will be some questions, and I'm open to any questions. And I just want to say what a privilege it was to speak today. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Roy. So we invite folks to provide us with their questions either in the Q&A section or via chat. We've had a couple that have come in on chat, but Roy, before I get to those questions, I wanted to go back to one that one of our audience members posed before about books. Books that would help people learn more about the history of the Métis in Canada. The thought that occurred to me is that there are many ways that we can learn about the culture or any culture. And I recall, and maybe I'm wrong, that a number of years ago there was actually a graphic novel that was produced, a comic book, if you will, that was produced about Louis Riel. Do you remember that one? I kind of looked over. I know of the comic book, and I know which one you're alluding to. There's been a lot of those kind of fictional stories arise in recent times. I didn't read through the comic book. I just kind of saw it. It wasn't something that I really took a look at. But even in pop culture today, if you look at propaganda from the past, or you look at media outlets, a lot of it have portrayed, especially the media. If you look at Louis Riel's figure and how it was portrayed, it's portrayed as being this villainous figure. So for me, I don't really know what the comic book said, but I know it was there, and I didn't really give it a read. Okay, I was wondering because the use of that particular means of sharing information, of course, isn't unique to the situation of the Métis. Within the Jewish community, there was a comic book that created a bit of a stir that came out in the 90s called Mouse, which was about Jews in the Holocaust. So I was just wondering if any opinion had formed and whether this is seen as being respectful or whether it might seem a little bit too flippant.
Yeah, I'd have to take a more in-depth look at the particular comic book, because I didn't really get a chance to read it. But from your point, I know that when we have historical anecdotes written by non-Métis people, there's always usually a point of contention because it doesn't come from our experiences in Canada,
Sure. Okay. So we have a question. So we have a question, and I will just read it. I struggle with the word rights. I don't want land rights or even harvesting rights. I just want the rights to the culture. Until recently, I was a member of the MNO, but they are questioning our lineage now, and I am so torn. I don't want people to think I'm appropriating, but some people base so much on that card. I've been raised with the cooking, I've been raised with the cooking, the food, family makeup, grandparents, speaking French, midship, and so on. So I guess my question is, since being raised as a Métis, I miss being able to feel proud, wear my sash, and share the culture. Okay, so not so much a question, I suppose. How would you react or respond to what's being shared?
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing, Melissa. And I know from a political and legal entity these days, there's been those challenges over accessing Métis identity through cards and so forth. And I remember back in the day, I was working for the provincial government of Saskatchewan in First Nations Métis relations, and I went up to a gentleman named Mark LaRocque, and I asked him then as a young guy, I'm like, do you have a Métis card? And his response was absolutely not. He knows who he is. He's Métis through and through. He's proud of his identity. So he doesn't need a card to prove that he's Métis. You know, oftentimes, you know, from a political entity, having a card to prove that your culture, again, that's been kind of a colonial usage, you know, in our country. So from my perspective, I completely understand what you're saying, because we know we have relatives out east. We know there are Métis communities out east. We know and we're aware of that. And I'm not politically involved to any degree. So from an identity perspective, I look at that subjective cultural identity and that pride in the culture. And I think that that makes someone Métis, is understanding the culture, being a part of the culture. And I don't think anyone across the homeland could debate that. From a political entity, yeah, there's been some changes politically to the historical homeland map that certainly will have an effect and an impact in those communities that are considered outside of the historic map. But again, I don't think this should do anything to damage like your cultural identity. Like, I think that people out east, people up in the north, who practice that cultural identity aside from the politics of it, I think there still should be a level of pride there. But I really understand what you're saying. I also think, you know, the biggest challenge is that the federal government, through the Daniels case, deals directly with the Métis National Council as the federal entity. So if we're looking more at political and legal rights of the Métis, that's who Canada is going to negotiate and talk with. And I think that's got other Métis organizations that have been spurring up around, you know, whether it's Métis or not. I won't get into that debate, but them saying, well, why can't we negotiate directly with a provincial government or a federal government? So these are some very challenging political and legal discussions that are certainly happening at that level. But I agree with you with the word rights. I'm in the same boat. I'm not a harvester, and you know, our land up in northern Saskatchewan, the only actual settled land for the Métis is northern Alberta in the Métis settlements. And maybe now with the MMF case, there will be some purchases in Manitoba. But from this standpoint, you're right. It's rights to the culture. It's practicing proudly as a Métis person. So, you know, my advice would be just to keep practicing and keep being proud and keep in the culture. I think you just got, bring that pride out. I really appreciate that comment.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Roy. So I suppose as a follow-up, and this was a question that came in through chat. So apropos to Métis identity. So what are some of the challenges with identifying Métis citizens? Yeah,
a lot of the challenges stem from that time period post-1885 that I kind of alluded to in my presentation. Was in our homeland, we were the Métis Nation. There was such a diaspora across Canada, and there was a lot of oppression. There was a lot of hatred, a lot of racism. So a lot of families abandoned the culture, and it's not till recently that the youth or the grandkids are now saying, "Oh man, I realized I had some Métis in my family, or my grandpa was Métis, but he didn't talk about it. And they're coming back to the culture. As well, if you look under the Indian Act and you look at status and non-status cards in that Section 6 of the Indian Act that essentially eliminates status, creates a non-status people in our country. Well, oftentimes in the past when you would gain non-status, for a sense of belonging, you might go into a Métis community. So even to this day, I mean, the government having a lot of control over people's identity, whether they're creating a status situation, a non-status situation, you know, through those very discriminatory policies, creates a real challenge when it comes to indigeneity or Indigenous identity politics, because people might be claiming Aboriginality for certain different reasons. But from the whole perspective, I mean, I truly believe from going across the Homeland, like a lot of Aboriginal people know their culture, they know it to some degree, they learn it, and they really get involved with it, and they really have some of that genealogical connection to kind of get into the culture. But for me specifically, I think that if people are identifying in any way that they identify, it's not really on me to question it. It's just a matter of, I hope that they're not appropriating the culture for their own personal gain, and that's in any context, whether it's First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. You just got to hope that, you know, people are bringing passion and pride to the culture and reclaiming their identity in a good way. And I think that that's a very important connotation to that.
Okay, excellent. So one of the issues, of course, that we face in not only in Canada but in other countries is that the contributions made by, you know, minority or marginalized communities are sometimes erased from the historical narrative. So, in your mind, so what are some of the important contributions that Métis have made in the development of Canada?
Yeah, there's a number of contributions. First and foremost, I mean, the obvious one is bringing Manitoba into Confederation as a Métis province at that time. I mean, that was a massive importance to the country. But even aside from that, the contributions that the Métis made to the fur trade industry and building a really strong economic base in this country. You know, we had invention and creations like the Red River cart, like the York boat. There was a lot of contributions to the trade that really expedited it. And I think that was really important to the development of our nation and our economy. You know, our first currency in this country was made beaver. You know, and when you tell international folks who come here today, whether you're teaching them in a classroom, you know, that's kind of, it seems too Canadian, you know, to have made beaver as your first currency. You know, even today politically, you know, Métis have really fought a lot in the Aboriginal rights arena. You know, a lot of Métis citizens have fought politically, not only for Métis rights, but also for our relatives on the First Nation side of things. You know, a lot of Métis folks that trace their genealogy and their background have relatives from, you know, in our case, Flying Dust First Nation, Waterhen First Nation. And it was, again, like a treaty, non-treaty separation and a status, non-status separation and a Métis, and then Métis communities. So from a contribution perspective, you know, even if you look at the civil rights era and the leader of Howard Adams, you know, bringing attention to not only Aboriginal rights, but Métis rights in the 60s, you know, fighting against the White Paper of 69, fighting alongside the Red Paper movements of the 70s. You know, Maria Campbell's contribution to educating about the road allowance system in Canada. You know, I think that when you look at Métis history, there's really an entwined and ingrained piece of Canadian history with that. And you'll even have some authors say that, you know, Métis are really Canadians because they came out of this mixture of settler society and First Nation society and built a society here on this land. So from that perspective, I think that you can say that the Métis are really kind of ingrained, especially with our historical story of how we developed as a country. Oh, sorry, just to further too, Len, in Saskatchewan, when the Métis were fighting in northern Saskatchewan to protect their cultural and land rights, Louis Riel always wanted to bring the homeland into Confederation. And during that time in Saskatchewan, the building of the CPR Railroad to connect the country because the Canadian government had to send troops out to northern Saskatchewan. But his contributions, the lands were being surveyed up again like they were in the Red River. And the Métis had to make a stance, and the government had a police force at that time. And so there was no real negotiations to it. It was more, it had to come down to a certain level of resistance. And so when you look at those contributions, even Riel, he wanted to bring in Saskatchewan as another province that respected the rights of the Métis and had it entrenched in their Confederation package.
So in an alternate universe, Louis Riel could have been one of the fathers of Confederation.
Well, he's a father of Confederation for Manitoba, but he potentially could have had two provinces.
Okay. A question from one of our public question from one of our participants. So, what is a good way to respond to racialized comments? I presume that means discriminatory comments that are rooted in misinformation. So, people who are just have it wrong are not necessarily malicious in their intent.
Yeah, no, I can really appreciate that. A lot of my work has been in anti-racism work, and oftentimes, me and my brother, being a light-skinned Métis, we've often faced situations where people are just talking in and around us or talking to us just because they, make an assumption that we agree with some of their politics or we agree with the way that they see their worldview is situated. But oftentimes our challenge in responding to racism, we're challenged to call it out because it creates awkward situations. It creates discomfort. It might be a boss of ours or somebody in a position of power that makes these statements. So it can always be relatively challenging. And oftentimes calling out, ignorance, I suppose, calling that out can be even more challenging if we ourselves don't have the facts and the history to understand how to combat such discussion. So, a lot of it stems down to is that you can call someone out for their racist comments, but if the person is believing that that's the way it is because of their upbringing or the way that they were told the history, it's very challenging to change their mind in a short discussion, as opposed to if you yourself understand the facts, understand how the history really was, understand what's in the Indian Act, understand why Métis identity is a bit askew. It's on a weekly basis that I have to correct someone on what Métis identity is. One time I heard someone say we're the product of raped Indian women, and that was just a horrible, horrible thing to hear. And again, calling that out was uncomfortable, but there's a whole history lesson there. So to answer the question, I don't know if there's any really good answer to the question other than to say that I think as Aboriginal people or even as Canadians, we need to know more of our joint history together in this country to be able to properly call out ignorance, because people who are ignorant oftentimes truly believe they're ignorant. And for us, it's kind of like the only way they might start to turn a leaf is if we engage them in proper conversation and we are able to factually deliver information to them that they can somewhat kind of internalize and hopefully change their mindset. It's not impossible. I think it takes a strong dialogue and a commitment to have those uncomfortable conversations. I hope that I did some justice to that question, but I know it's one that I commonly face as well.
Okay. Thank you very much, Roy. It was a difficult question. I'm not sure that there's a perfect answer for it. So we're coming to the end of our time, but we do encourage people to give us any last questions they may have. Roy, I have one more for you in the stack. The recent release of the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls has reopened the question of the Aboriginal experience in settler Canada and whether that experience can be deemed to have been a genocide. It's a bit of a hot potato, but what are your thoughts on the discussion, and have you come to your own conclusions?
Yeah, so after researching a lot of the history and studying Indigenous studies, teaching Indigenous studies, looking at even the United Nations definition on what genocide is, understanding that genocide isn't just one specific related event, that it can be a long period of systemic policies that create systems or systems of genocide. When we look back at our history, there was smallpox blankets sent out to reserves as first forms of biological warfare. You look at the Indian Act and eliminating status from First Nations women for just marrying out or having children out of the culture. And directly in genocide, it is removing people. You look at the children that died in the residential school system. You look at the assimilation policies around child welfare in our country. You look at even the white paper of 1969 that tried to eliminate all cultural identity, reserves, treaties, everything as a form of a government bill that was going to be passed through the Liberal Party at that time. When you look at our country's history, if you look at the notion of apartheid, we have an Indian Act that directly governs a specific group of people in our country. That is the definition of apartheid. So one could even say from a relational perspective is how are we going to reconcile with a document? That's when I talked about the Penna report. The goal was to eliminate the Indian Act and move on with capacity building in communities and bring on a level of self-determination and self-government in our communities. And that was scrapped again by another change in government, along with the Kelowna Accord. When Paul Martin was introducing the Kelowna Accord, that was another very important document that was going to come forward, and again was scrapped by an incoming government. When we look at Indigenous affairs itself, or we look at the current state we're in, even from the justice system, when you look at the levels of incarceration, when you look at the child welfare system and the levels of children in care, I don't know what else, proof or facts I would have to put forward to say that, genocide from a historical entity, definitely it fits that definition. But even today, a lot of our policies or a lot of our institutions still have institutionalized racism, systemic discrimination. It's a contested term because a lot of people associate it with two large events that they're familiar with, the genocide in Rwanda, which was highly published by Romeo Dallaire. And so a lot of Canadians, we know about Rwanda. A lot of Canadians, of course, have heard about the Holocaust. And so they see genocide as the term of a quick period of massive killing and death. And that's what we've been kind of known to see genocide as. Whereas if you look at that definition, it is really trying to force culture out of somebody. It's removing them. It's death in childcare. It's a number of things. It's even suicide rates that come out of a lot of this oppression. It came out and it was a term that I think is going to be debated for some time. And I think in our country, you have the Aboriginal experience and then you have the settler experience. And they're two, as in the words of Dr. Leroy Littlebear, they're two jagged worlds colliding. And when those worlds collide, we're always going to have contested dialogue. But at the same time, I think it's important that we have this dialogue. And hopefully there will be good things that come out of this dialogue in the future. And we can really start to move on a path towards a true reconciliation. And the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report is such an important report for that. Even further advancing just even the gender binary and looking at LGBTQ mixed within the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report or inquiry. And I think that that's just so vitally important in our new world, especially when we look at how politics can quickly change the landscape.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Roy. We have one last question, but please, if anyone has one more that they want to get in, please, this is your chance to do it. So, Roy, how would you recommend that someone go about getting more involved and more in touch with the Métis culture?
Yeah, you know, it's always very interesting, but I always go back to the elders. You know, a lot of our traditional knowledge keepers, a lot of our elders they're very open and welcoming to have discussions about Métis culture. And I've met some amazing elders across the homeland. So I often tell young people, outside of getting connected politically to your local or your chartered community or whatever it might be called, you might want to just go and sit down and have discussions with an elder, whether that be at a university or in a community event or what have you. And I think having those discussions with an elder really leads you to learn more about yourself and understand more about the culture and to hear the stories. I think the stories are vitally important. No matter what community I move to, I always ensure that I'm in communication with a Métis elder, and that we're talking about the history and that we're sharing culture with each other, because it's just so vitally important, not only for my well-being, but just to maintain that level of connectedness and to continue to hear stories and just be involved. So that would be my advice to someone who knows that they're Métis, but because of history or colonialism or what have you, may have been removed from their culture. That's one way to get involved or back into the culture.
Okay, Roy, thank you for that. And we have reached the end of our time and the end of the list of questions that members of the audience had submitted. So, Roy, on behalf of the Race Relations Foundation, we really thank you for this very informative presentation. And just to let folks know, the recording of this presentation will be posted on the Race Relations Foundation by the end of this week. And if we ask Roy nicely, without putting him on the spot at all, he might even let us post the PowerPoint slides.
Yeah, absolutely. I have
no pressure.
No, that's fine by me.
Okay. Well, again, Roy, thank you very much. Thank you, merci, miigwech, and we look forward to having you back again. And thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. And keep an eye on our website for future webinars.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.